Today we interview historian and professor at Stanford University, Gordon H. Chang, about the participation of Chinese immigrants in the building of modern America. Hey everyone, I'm Jason Smith, originally from sunny California, now living in beautiful Beijing. Dr. Gordon H. Chang is a professor in humanities affiliated faculty by courtesy of East Asian languages and culture at Stanford University. He's written numerous books, including War, Race, and Culture, The Chinese and the Iron Road, The Ghosts of Gold Mountain, which I got a copy of here, uh, Friends and Enemies, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union, 1948 to 1972. And I'm happy to say for our listeners, because I checked, you can find his books, some of them in Chinese and English, on JD and Taobao. Welcome to the Bridge to China, Professor Chang. So, Zhang, as in
Yeah.
said. Oh, okay, sure.
All
Zhang,
right.
Professor Zhang. It's nice to have you on the program. So I wanted to ask you what drew you to the study of, Chinese laborers working on the Transcontinental Railroad in books like The Ghost of Gold Mountain.
The topic of Chinese working on U.S. railroads has been long-standing, but relatively unknown among the general public about details, about what actually happened. When I was growing up in California, I'd heard about the Chinese railroad workers. I'm fourth generation Californian, but try as I did, I could find very little information, published information about the railroad workers. So it was always a question in my mind about them. And it wasn't until later on, much later on in my career, when I had some time I could devote to deep study, that I went back to this topic to see what I could do. And so my interest in the railroad workers comes because of a personal connection. My ancestors came to California in the 1850s and 1860s, and I don't think I have any railroad workers in my lineage, but I know that my predecessors had contact with them. So it was a personal interest, but also an academic one or intellectual one, where the historical record as given was woefully inadequate in telling their story.
So are you the first American historian to take this on in great detail, would you say?
In a word, yes. There's there is material one can find in histories of the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad was constructed from 1862 and completed in 1869, and it was known as the Transcontinental Railroad, the first Transcontinental Railroad, the railroad that spanned the continent from New York City to San Francisco. And it was an epic project because of the size of the challenge, the difficulty of the challenge with terrain and financing and many other matters. And though Chinese were known to have been connected to it, no one really knew very much about their extent. And the existing literature may have had a few paragraphs about them, acknowledging them, but nothing about their lived experience, that is to say, what they actually experienced, and any detail about who they were, where they came from, what happened to them, what kind of work they did, what were their accomplishments, what their responsibilities on the railroad. And that's what I undertook to try to uncover and I'm very proud. I think I did about as best an effort that could be done. And now we have a story that's much more complete than before.
Well, yeah, I took a crack at the book, and it has some amazing passages in it. I recommend anyone who has the opportunity to pick a copy of this up to read it. And just the first few chapters, which I've read, are incredibly illuminating and just very well told. I can smell the air. I can see things happening. The way people are dressed is absolutely amazing. So good work. So I wanted to talk about the power relations and the relationship of the Chinese workers with the companies. So how did Chinese workers negotiate power with the companies, local governments, other ethnic groups? How did they work together?
Well, I'll get to that in a moment, but thank you Jason, for your brief description of the book. I'm very flattered by your take on it, including that you could just about smell history And that's what I wanted to do. When I talked about lived experience, I didn't want to write about the Chinese railroad workers as a sort of nameless objects. I tried to name them because the other accounts didn't even give them names, didn't even know where they came from in China. And so I remedied those matters, which are fairly simple to do. But then I tried to really think about and convey what their world might have been like or was like, both in terms of sights, smells, temperature, the climate, the terrain, the skies, to give readers some sense of what they actually experience. And that's what I meant by felt experience. So that meant going back and looking at the sources in different ways. So I looked at weather reports, I looked at travel logs about descriptions of the countryside in California, other travelers' accounts of what they saw. So I try to capture all those those experiences, and suggest that this is what the Chinese workers then must have felt. Now, in terms of your question about the power relationship, it was a great inequality, of course. The Chinese had started to come to California in the early 1850s in some number, in the years just following the high point of the California gold rush. So there were tens of thousands of Chinese in California by the early 1860s. Most of them in the gold country, some concentrated in San Francisco, in what we call Chinatown, but most were workers, laborers, entrepreneurs of some sort, maybe some fishermen, some farmers, but a good number of them had experience in building infrastructure, bridges, roads, and this type of thing, because they were workers, and California was sparsely populated overall at that time, because it was impossible for many people to come out to California, and those who did faced a very arduous journey. It took somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks, maybe even more, to get from New York to San Francisco. And there were only 3 routes to get from New York to San Francisco. One route was overland, where workers or people, immigrants who wanted to come to California, would go out to Nebraska or thereabouts, and then walk the rest of the way, about 2,000 miles, through Indian country, it was called, and it was very dangerous because the native people still fought ferociously to control and protect their area. And that had difficulties because you had to cross deserts and great mountains, and when you get to California, just before you enter, you face the eastern portion of the Sierra Nevada, the most rigorous mountain range in continental United States. And in the 1840s, there was a tragic story of the Donner Party, who got caught in the traverse. They got caught, they couldn't go forward or backward with the winter storm, and they were stuck there for weeks and descended into cannibalism. So that's a graphic example of how dangerous that route was. Then there were routes from vessels, New York, that had to go all the way down the southern tip of South America and come all the way up, or another vessel or another way would go to Panama and then walk across Isthmus of Panama and take another vessel all the way up. So it was very tough and dangerous, all the different ways, dangerous sea routes, disease. So there was California was sparsely populated, and the railroad executives turned to the Chinese because they were desperate for labor. They needed thousands of workers, and they could only a few hundred workers. When they first advertised, they wanted only white workers. But the white workers who themselves had been miners or prospectors really didn't want to do railroad work. And that's how it came to the Chinese. So they started out in some small number, but then because they were so capable and effective, the railroad executive barons hired more and more and more and more until there were thousands, maybe up to 20,000 total over all of the 7 years. So they constituted something like 90% of the construction workforce. And that meant that even though individually they had little power, collectively they had enormous power, because without them, the railroad would not have been built. So they could negotiate their terms to some extent. They had very little legal power or economic power, trade union. They didn't have a trade union of this sort. But the best example of this is in a strike that 3,000 of them conducted at the height of the labor season in 67, 68, where they stopped working and to impress the railroad barons of their invaluable work and what they were able to provide. And the railroad barons were just not able to recruit the number of workers from other backgrounds to fill the work that the Chinese did. So it was a unequal relationship in different ways.
Mhm. That's fascinating. Could we go off topic of the plan questions a little bit? Could we talk about their origins? Because you mentioned how people from Europe who were living on the East Coast could get to California. How did these workers originate, and how did they decide? Oh, I want to move to California in the first place, and how did they get to California?
Yeah, I mean, some of the European background workers or the
No,
Chinese?
no, the Chinese workers instead, because you mentioned the European workers, how they got to California. Could we talk about how the Chinese workers got to California? What's their origin story? Why did people leave China to go to California in the first place?
Right, right. Well, the Chinese who wound up in California, more than 90%. It's hard to know. We don't have accurate uh, numbers for a lot of this, but we have general numbers. And the vast majority of the Chinese who came to California in the 19th century, certainly at this earlier time, even more than 90%, maybe 95% or so, all came from the southern region near Hong Kong and Macau, or was called in the Pearl River Delta. And there are counties there that had a history of outmigration to other parts of Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and then also when the gold rush happened, they were able to leave China. It was forbidden actually to leave China by imperial decree at the time, but they were close enough to Hong Kong and Macau to use uh, European or American vessels to get across the big Pacific to come to California. Most of them left to seek their fortune in the gold rush. They heard great tales about the availability of gold and how easy it was to pick up and then return back to China as a rich man. And there were a few, people who did that, and they came back with these tales and pieces of gold, and Chinese love gold, and so it was quite powerful attraction. And so that's how they first got to California, and then they began to set up a regular route using these early transportation across the Pacific to get to California. Uh, Fewer and fewer went into gold mining, although many of them still hoped to be able to strike it rich. But they came over and found other ways to make money as wage workers, as contract workers. I should say, as contract workers, I should clarify that a number of Chinese worked not as individuals but as teams, in teams of other Chinese under a Chinese entrepreneur, businessman, or contractor. And he would work with a white farmer or landowner or city government or something of this sort to build roads, to build dams or levees, and he would provide the labor to them. So it was a different kind of labor system. But the Chinese wound up in California originally to seek gold and remained very much connected to their home villages in South China.
Wow, that's quite an amazing story. When I've talked to people who are third generation, I tried to speak some Cantonese with them. They referred to the way they speak as Toi San Hua. So I was always a little bit confused. That must be a specific dialect that is maybe not around as much in Guangdong anymore. Um, I'm
Oh, we
also
have to
fascinated.
say, I'll say
Go
that
ahead.
yeah, you're right, and I use the term Cantonese as a general term that we use in the United States for non-Mandarin, largely speaking, and the dialect, the regional dialect, a big rubric called Cantonese. But within Cantonese, there are sub-dialects, and Toisawa is one of them, and that is the name. Taishan is the name today of the county down in that area, not far from Guangzhou.
That's actually really fascinating. I find it interesting the way that sometimes British tea culture is preserved in a sort of more antique way in South Africa. And so when I think about the Chinese diaspora, I wonder how much of the habits and the behaviors of the Chinese community in America are from a period that has kind of passed by a little bit. How much of it is modern Chinese, and how much of it modern China doesn't maybe do some of the same exact things anymore. So I find that really fascinating. So I wanted to talk about, because obviously the white Americans have been oppressing a lot of other races for hundreds of years, and this goes for pretty much every race that didn't come from Western Europe. So, what role did racism, legal exclusion, and anti-Chinese sentiment play in structuring the experiences of the railroad workers?
The question is a good one because the early history of Chinese in America, what I mean early is the early, mid to late 19th century and into the 20th century, is replete with terrible tales of violence meted out against Chinese. There was great racism against Chinese and other people who were not white. This racism, anti uh, people of color racism, is inherited or rooted in a long history of slavery in the United States. But Chinese also inherited this prejudice against them as being non-European derived. They were widely seen as deeply foreign, alien, mysterious, unwelcome, civilized, uncultured, literally inferior, both physically, mentally, and in other ways. And so they had to overcome these or challenge, or they had to face these sentiments from the general white population, and suffered terribly. There was California in the mid 19th century was one of the most dangerous places in the world for Chinese to be. They would be shot, killed, robbed, beaten up for their gold if they had found any on their bodies, and suffered physical violence simply because of who they were. There are the accounts of this violence are numerous in the newspapers, in the legal records, in storytelling, because not everything is recorded at the time. So really quite terrible torture at times, and I'm not holding back here, of Chinese, and yet they persisted, and they tried to find ways to get remedy, going to courts, finding attorneys to represent their cases, challenging unfair laws in the courts, and also banding together to to resist the anti-Chinese violence. It's a dramatic story, and the Chinese railroad workers faced that because, as I said right from the beginning, there was prejudice against them. Railroad executives didn't want to turn to the Chinese because they thought they couldn't be managed. They thought they were physically incapable of doing such arduous work as building a railroad, which required massive cutting of trees and groundwork and tunneling, trestle work. But they proved very, very capable and so extraordinary workers and proved their worth to the railroad company. So because of their work and exemplary work, there was some change of sentiment. I mean, there's certainly always Americans, white Americans, who respected the Chinese, who hired them, who thought it was unchristian, unfair, inhuman to be prejudiced against them. That was a small number, but after the railroad was constructed, actually there was quite a bit of celebration of them in the newspapers and in public for what they helped to accomplish.
Well, I'm glad that you put some kind of happy ending on the end of that tragic story. Can we talk about how the Chinese diaspora is influencing American history, not only American history, but also trans-Pacific relations and exchanges? Because, on the East Coast, it's European facing, African facing. On the West Coast, it's very much Asian facing, Chinese facing. So, like, how have the Chinese community living in the United States enhanced or just changed U.S. relationships with Asia and China?
Chinese Americans, I include myself among them, are very proud of our history. And even though the numbers dwindled dramatically in the early 20th century because of the anti-Chinese laws, immigration laws, what we call the exclusion laws, the Chinese were the first people to be designated to be undesirable and unwelcome to the United States legally. So immigration of Chinese to the United States was severely restricted. Chinese were virtually excluded from the United States until the mid 20th century. So the numbers dwindled because people went back. It was too hostile here, and there was very little natural reproduction. Chinese women in particular were very, very scarce. They didn't come over in many numbers, and intermarriage was it was made illegal in most states. But those Chinese who did persist had families, reproduced, and that we have their descendants today, such as those in my generation. And many in my generation are proud of their history and have made tremendous efforts to recover that history. So they've gone back to try to recover their history, do family histories, locate archives, locate physical structures, and help to reclaim and rebuild that history. And that's part of their efforts are some of the things that I use to help reconstruct the history in Ghosts of Gold Mountain. But the Chinese today, I think, are still inspired by that legacy, even those who have come more recently. And they many feel akin to that earlier history, although it's far removed from them personally, in their families, and even their origin. As we've said, the Chinese in the early days came from southern China, and Chinese today in the United States come from many regions of China. But it is a history that attracts much interest, and people seek to recover it because it helps to claim Chinese presence in America today as a legitimate presence in the United States. So the argument basically is the Chinese people have been in the United States for more than a century and a half and have contributed mightily to the United States. And thus the sentiments that are placed upon Chinese that make them to be foreign, alien, non-American are misplaced, wrong, and hateful. And recovering history actually has a great contemporary importance.
That's kind of where I wanted to go with the next question, because we have seen an incremental rise in anti-Asian hate crimes in the United States over the last few years. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think the study of Chinese labor and diaspora shapes our understanding of modern American culture?
There has always been anti-Chinese sentiment and violence, as we've talked about before. But during the COVID crisis, back 5-6 years ago, there was a real cresting of anti-Asian sentiment, in part because authorities suggested or accused China, and Chinese as agents of propagating the disease. And so Chinese and China were scapegoated as the source of this global pandemic. And in the United States, anyone who looked Chinese or Asian, whether it be Latinos, Filipinos, South Asians, let alone people who are of Chinese ancestry, were assaulted, received slurs, had their businesses vandalized because they were popular sentiment thought that the Chinese were malign and should be driven out of the United States. So recovering history is important to counteract those prejudices, those assumptions, hateful assumptions, to show what the real history has been, and to show that Chinese and other Asians have been a legitimate and contributing part of American life from the beginning of their presence. The sentiment, the hatred that they faced was connected to a broader movement of reaction, I would call it, in the United States of anti-immigrant sentiment. So not just Chinese, but other people from around the world who have been immigrants have also faced tremendous hostility. As we know from the newspapers every day, the president is just going out and trying to deport millions of people who have come into the United States, and many of them legitimate workers. A few weeks ago, 350 Korean nationals who were working at a Hyundai factory in Georgia were all rounded up, and they were all here under work visas and mistreated terribly, and then threatened to be returned to Korea. So the newspapers, the general public, just accepts these because there is anti-immigrant sentiment among big sectors of the American population. Unfortunately, immigrants of whatever color now are facing a lot of suspicion and hatred.
Well, we do see a lot of specifically Chinese scientists and other kinds of members of the business community who are actually have a great deal of power in their own communities and their own fields. What role do you think that this history also can play in U.S.-China relations today, especially over, right now, like in the issues that you just pointed out, human rights and also the trade war? Do you think that this history and the community that has been built here in the United States can play a role in ameliorating relations between China and the U.S.?
The history of Chinese immigration to the United States is characterized by two sort of demographics. One are those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, mainly as farmers, small business people, particularly from southern China, and then others who came to the United States from professional backgrounds or aspiring professionals who came to the United States as international students or came as scientists and engineers. And those numbers have been in some significant size, coming from beginning in the early 20th century. There's been a long history of Chinese intellectuals, students, academics coming to the United States to advance their own careers or to study and then return, possibly to go to China. Now, over the years, they have become a very important part of the American academic elite. American institutions are populated with Chinese chemists, engineers, medical professionals. Private industry has employed many engineers and others of high technical ability. So they've become a very important part of American industrial, commercial, and academic lives. That has had a downside too, where conservative or reactionary authorities see all this and raise suspicion against the Chinese and blanketly suggest that or even accuse that Chinese are a dangerous force to the United States, an alien force, and many of them actually being secret spies working for the CCP and stealing American technology, American knowledge, industrial secrets, scientific knowledge for China's benefit. Tragically, over the past 10 years now, there have been a consistent campaign to investigate Chinese scientists, engineers, technical people with some very prominent profiles of terrible mistreatment of some of these people, and almost all of them proven to be completely innocent, but they were victims of what one might say as being Chinese while doing research is a racial profiling. And that, unfortunately, the FBI, the federal government, engaged in that over these years. And a number of Chinese are returning to China because of the hostile environment in which we have. And even to the extent where Trump said a few months ago is that he thought all Chinese international students, now some 300,000 in the United States, were somehow suspect and should all be sent back to China. Now, since, as Trump does, he's backtracked on that. But when he says these things, it certainly has lots of implication, and it causes other people to look at Chinese as somehow suspects. And then this even goes over to how people see China itself, and they hear these words. And most Americans know very, very little about China, and certainly about its economic development and the circumstances of China's rise in the past, 30, 40 years. And they say, how can this country with these people do what they've done? And we see these big, big pictures of Shanghai or Beijing. And they say, well, it's because they've stolen all this from the United States. They've stolen all the knowledge. So they don't even acknowledge that China has worked hard, people are smart, and done all these things to build the country up in an extraordinary way. So it has a lot of far-reaching implications. Now, many Chinese successful people, and I know a number of them through my association with what's called the Committee of 100, business people, other professionals, have also felt this very deeply and are very, very worried about the state of U.S.-China relations and the targeting of Chinese Americans by this reactionary trend. So they have spoken out, have created forums to try to do publicity work and educational work to try to dispel, certainly counteract this anti-Chinese sentiment.
I wish them well. It sounds like a lot of work. This show we call The Bridge to China. We seek to bring more Americans to China, to study here, to work here, and we hope more Chinese can go to the United States also. I think the people who are probably most capable of bridging these two nations and cultures are the Chinese Americans living in the United States. So there's a lot of work to be done. On that theme, you wrote War, Race, and Culture Journeys in Trans-Pacific and Asian American Histories. I wanted to ask you, what are some of the most pressing open questions in the history of Chinese participating in building America, not just the railroad, but other aspects of modern America?
Well, actually, I'm working, my current research project is to study the life of a famous Chinese scientist, Dr. Qian Xuesen. And I don't know if you know his name, but he's very, very famous among many Chinese today because of his work and life in the United States. I'll tell you a little bit about him because he's representative of this matter that you've raised. He came to the United States from Hangzhou, Shanghai in 1935. He was a graduate of Jiaotong University. And he came a very, very talented young man. He came to the US to study at MIT and then Caltech. He got his PhDs in aerodynamic engineering, which was a very exotic, strange field of study at the time. This is rocket science, literally rocket science. And he quickly became a world authority. He was quite brilliant by all accounts and by his contemporaries and his professors. And he became not just capable, but an equal to the most senior specialists at the time. He was so accomplished that he got positions as a young professor, as a young doctor at MIT and then Caltech. And the U.S. Army even liked him so much that they brought him into the Army in 1945, put him into a colonel's uniform, and sent him to Germany with others to study the Nazi rocket program. So he received high-level clearance, security clearance to pursue his research at Caltech and MIT and also for the US government. But then in the late 1940s, federal authorities began to suspect him or accused him of being a secret subversive communist because of his association 10 years earlier when he was a graduate student at Caltech. And he lost his security clearance. He was slandered in the press of being a secret red, and the United States was awash with anti-communism at the time. It was hard to be anything worse than a communist accused of communist at the time, even though China, Soviet Union, United States were all allies during World War II and had fought together against the Nazis. But then the sentiment changed quickly with the advent of the Cold War. And the Cold War rose, and Qian and others, all the way from Einstein to Oppenheimer to many other scientists became suspect, even those who were at the highest level of security clearance. So Qian eventually was so mistreated by the authorities that he decided he wanted to just quit the United States and return to China. but he was prevented from doing so by the federal government, even though he had committed no crime. He had not assaulted anybody, robbed anyone. He was accused with a suspicion from 10 years earlier on the testimony, often shaky by those who were in leftist circles in passing. I mean, a lot of people were in the left in the early years of the build up to the entry into World War II, anti-fascist sentiment era. And then he left the United States when the stay in order was lifted in 1955. And he packed up his goods, his family, and returned to China and became one of China's most famous scientists, and the father, it is said, of China's missile program.
Wow, that's kind of ironic. Um, do you see parallels today? Because we do see a lot of extremely prominent, highly talented scientists in the United States of Chinese origin who are returning to China to work at prestigious universities in Beijing, Shanghai, Hangzhou, and other cities.
Yes, well, this is why his story, Qian's story, has been resurrected. It's been circulated widely as a cautionary tale to other Americans. It said, look, if you pursue this sort of irrational or extreme campaign against people of Chinese ancestry, this is what can happen. You will have the self-inflicted wound where you drive these talented people back to a country where you don't want them to go, but they will go because they have better opportunities and resources to pursue the work, not under the suspicion that they had in the United States. So it is widely known. I mean, here when I talk about this, and even senior uh, colleagues at Stanford and others, many of them heard about this story because you use the term ironic. Other people say it's ironic, it's a self-inflicted wound. It just shows how people would say it was so unwise, so stupid for the United States to do that because they lost somebody they knew they wanted, but because of the mistreatment made him change his mind. He had wanted to stay in the United States, but then he switched tracks and decided to give up the United States, even though he had been here for 15 years, more than almost 20 years before returning to China for good. And he was so embittered by his experience that he refused to ever come back to the United States, even though he was invited on numerous occasions to receive awards, to be honored by friends and colleagues. But he said no because the United States government had been so had so mistreated him that he wanted nothing to do with coming back to the U.S.
It is a very troubling parallel because it seems like I see one or two Chinese scientists of some note in the United States who are deciding to leave for China and other countries around the world. And it seems like the United States wants to be, premier in science and technology, and yet the environment that the U.S. government, the FBI, are producing for some of these top-notch scientists is not one which would attract people to stay in the United States. And this is deeply troubling. Do you have contact with other experts in the United States who are feeling uncomfortable because of recent policies over the last 5 to 10 years?
Absolutely. I mean, what you've described is a pretty common experience among Chinese technical workers or professional scientists, including here at Stanford. So I know Stanford colleagues of Chinese ancestry who who were visited by the FBI, who were harassed by the FBI, whose families felt threatened by the FBI because they would go to their homes on a Sunday morning unannounced and just knock at the door and ask, wanted to come in. And this was a few years ago. They didn't have a arrest warrant or search warrant or anything, but did so simply, I think, just to let people know we're here, we're watching you. You better be careful, and if you do anything wrong, we're going to get you. So
Wow.
scientists with other backgrounds didn't suffer anything like this, and there are scientists we know. I mean, there's unethical, unprofessional behavior by a lot of people from many different countries for personal reasons, for financial gain, and so forth. But Chinese, by and large, have not been distinguished by this kind of behavior. But political authorities have tagged him with this, and it became even codified by Trump when he was in his first term with what was called the China Initiative, where he wanted to investigate China ties with China. This is where TikTok started out, and Huawei investigation in the United States, and also with Chinese international students and professors. And the conservative newspaper at Stanford just a few months ago published a very sensational article that said that the Chinese Communist Party is operating at Stanford University. And without giving names or people, said that there are Chinese spies all around Stanford. And this is just spread without question, and it's not just at Stanford, but all around the country these days.
Well, I mean, in terms of history, you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that seems to be kind of a parallel with today's environment, at least the sentiment. What was done or what happened at that time? Did it just pass into history and people forgot about it? Or how was it dealt with at that time? And is there something we can learn about how to deal with the current situation?
The Chinese Exclusion Act acts, there were a number of them, became more and more stringent over the years, began in 1882. We're not, and their dismantling, it didn't happen overnight, began in 1943 in the midst of World War II, when the United States and China were allies in war. And this anti-Chinese law policy was a glaring insult to China, to say that they were Chinese immigrants or aliens ineligible to citizenship and could not come to the United States except for certain exempt categories. So world events actually contribute to the beginning of the dismantling of the Exclusion Acts. The ability of Chinese who did come to the United States as international students or some of these exempt classes showed that Chinese could be highly successful and contribute significantly to U.S. economy and society. So by their own example, they became what my colleague has called the good immigrants, and this is now in the 50s and 1960s, and they began to be accepted in increased numbers as international students. And then finally, in 1965, there was a major change in U.S. immigration law. But the Chinese themselves, particularly those who came in after 1943, distinguished themselves in many ways and became quite respected as capable professionals and scientists. So today, there's still that memory, and a lot of Chinese work hard to distinguish themselves, try to be good citizens, try to be good members of American society, and that means also to go into politics. So it's very, very interesting where more and more Chinese or Chinese ancestry people are going into American electoral politics, going in for local races, council members, as mayors, judges, and then all the way up to the federal level. We see more and more Asians going into politics. I say Asians because most prominently we have the example of Kamala Harris, who ran for president of the United States, and she was very proudly of South Asian ancestry. And many Chinese Americans who consider themselves as from Asia will identify with the larger rubric of Asian American and are heartened by the success of Harris and others to go into politics and in those areas to make some difference, not to be special advocates of an ethnic group or a racial group, but to be exemplary political figures contributing to the good of American life. So we see more and more of that, and by I think those examples, by the good work of students. Stanford now is something like 24% undergraduate are Asian American. I mean, it's an extraordinary number. And other campuses such as UC's LA or UC Irvine, UC Berkeley, are somewhere between 40 and 60% Asian American. So the numbers of successful, studious, hardworking, smart Asian Americans coming to the fore is well known. In fact, unfortunately, that also has a negative consequence, because now they're saying that People who don't like this, they say, well, how come there are not more white students in the universities? How come there's so many Asians? Are they being favored? Are they playing unfair? Or maybe they're just too studious, it's even been said. They work too hard. We can't keep up with them. So their positive qualities become a negative in the eyes and the telling of some.
You
Quite
mentioned this. Sorry, you mentioned the success of Beijing and Shanghai and being seen internationally for the success of the growth of the Chinese economy. China is doing all kinds of amazing things now. China leads in all kinds of technologies like EVs, solar panels, wind, battery technology, rare earth mineral processing, all kinds of things that the United States wants to also be good at, and that things that wherein the United States used to lead in many of these fields, like car production, for example. There are a lot of Chinese immigrants in the United States now, recent immigrants that have come, this generation. How can these people help build new bridges of communication between China and the United States? Because as an American, I also want to see America succeed. And it seems like if the US and China work together, the United States could, be part of what China is building today, which is, it looks like the scientific future to me.
I agree with you entirely, Jason. I think we can look back just in recent history, back to the late 1990s, early 2000s, when U.S.-China professional, scientific, educational, and business relations were good. And both countries benefited enormously. We can look at the success of Apple and Nike and other companies in the United States, and American consumers benefited mightily with lower prices, a variety of goods. People made lots of money on both sides of the Pacific, and lots of everyday people benefited from the collaboration. Now that seems like a distant history now because there's so many people who are turning against China. We know about the famous or infamous Trump tariffs and suggesting that all that was unfair to the United States. The United States got taken. He's talking about how China conducted the greatest rape in history of the where it exploited and took advantage of the United States. So Trump has played up this victimhood, American victimhood, and China is one of the victimizers. Now, that's all grossly wrong, but it plays to an audience. And Chinese Americans try to fight back against it, to do historical work, as we've talked about, work hard and be ethical people on their own accord today to to try to counteract the sentiment. And a lot of Americans, it must be said, are fair-minded and they reject the stigma placed upon Chinese. But a lot of others still have this deep suspicion or hatred of Chinese and other Asians. Now, it must be said that the authorities are not making some of this very easy because state legislatures and local governments are trying to pass laws now that they believe are restricting or preventing Chinese communist presence in the United States. These include laws prohibiting Chinese citizens from preventing them from buying American property, real estate, farmland, businesses. So part of buying and selling property, of course, is part of the economy now. But these laws harken back to an earlier time in the 20th century, which were called alien land laws that prevented Chinese and other specified aliens from purchasing land in the United States to privilege white Americans or Native Americans in the marketplace. And these laws are coming back in Florida and Texas, other countries, and it remains to be seen how far they'll go. So far, they've been upheld by local courts, but this has made it very difficult for Chinese companies to do business in the United States. You have the whole TikTok business and other matters where Trump is using this as an example to try to disentangle rather than to encourage collaboration between China's educational, scientific, and business units from working with Americans. So it's becoming more difficult, not less difficult, despite the efforts of Chinese Americans to 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 oppose these measures, which are, in my view, quite discriminatory.
Um, let's talk about students for a moment because an enormous amount of graduate students in the United States are come from China, Japan, India, a lot of countries around the world with very qualified candidates, and this has been a huge boon to the United States because, quite honestly, our K through 12 education system does not produce the STEM qualified candidates that the United States needs. So Chinese students, Indian students have been filling a need for the United States and enabling U.S. research to continue and to be, on par with the best in the world. Do you see discriminatory practices and visa rescheduling? This became a huge issue at Harvard, where some visas were potentially going to be rejected as putting U.S. scientific primacy in danger.
Yeah, so it has already. I mean, this goes back several years where authorities were trying to limit the length of what we call postdoctoral study in the United States. Postdoctoral study is where those who've recently got a PhD, say in physics or electrical engineering, find a position at a university to continue their studies. And typically, those positions, which are very attractive, would last for 2 or 3 years, so they could continue the research and contribute to the labs. And Stanford had a lot of them. But then the authorities came down and they said, no, you can only have 1 year. And now they're trying to even cancel many of those. 1 year, as my colleagues in those fields point out, is no time at all because it takes 1 year just to settle down and get. And 1 year, 2 or 3 years is what you really need. So this began sometime already. And many of these postdocs or young graduate students were seen as possible sources of espionage and theft in the United States. And that suspicion has continued over the years. Now, you may know, it has been in the news, that the Trump wants to impose a $100,000 fee for new H-1B visas, which was a highly sought after visa used by technical people, scientists, people with special knowledge from South Asia or from China to come to the United States. Silicon Valley, where I am here, is just populated with thousands of international engineers and scientific workers. And this H-1 visa with a $100,000 price tag is sending shudders throughout the industry. Some welcome it, but others say this is going to be terrible. It's going to shut down a lot of companies who have relied on that talent to build the innovation of Silicon Valley. When I'm here, if you want to ever Silicon Valley, it's incredible to drive around and see the number of communities, shopping areas that are South Asian, Korean, Chinese, Taiwanese, all sorts of backgrounds are evident here. So it's a big part of everyday life in Silicon Valley and technical life and university life all around the country. So we feel this kind of prejudice quite acutely.
Do you see
So
any
it
silver?
doesn't.
Go ahead,
It
sorry.
seems to be counterintuitive. Why is the United States doing this? Well, part of it is just part of the broader agenda that Trump has of characterizing the United States as being victimized, of trying to build a fortress of America, exclude foreigners in various ways, from poor farm workers to accomplished scientists. And it seems irrational on a specific basis, but on a broader basis, it's all part of this "Make America Great" movement.
If you give me permission, I'd like to read 2 sentences from your book, if you allow me to read it on the air.
I would be flattered.
I find your writing absolutely beautiful, and I just thought that some of this really stuck out to me. The first sentence is quite long, but I think it's worth it. They endured scorching summer heat in the high altitude, dirt and choking dust, smoke, and fumes from the constant use of explosive. They survived isolation, desiccating winds and thin air, winter blizzards, and freezing temperatures, as well as the ever present dangers of accidental explosions, falling trees, snowslides, avalanches, cave ins, illness, broken limbs, and plain exhaustion, all to realize the federal government's great ambition of uniting the American continent with a central artery. These workers, in no short order, helped solidify the westward future of the United States. When I read this, it really struck, because this was at the time that the Civil War was being finished, that this artery was also being finished, a few years apart. And it seemed like the United States, was tenuous at best. Part of it was trying to break off. But owing to the work of these immigrants from China, the United States was able to solidify its east-west connection and actually rebuild the United States at a critical juncture. And it seems like we're in a similar period today where, what the United States needs is unity. And I appreciate your writing, not just for its eloquence, but also for the importance that it has on contemporary issues. And I hope more people can take the chance to read your books, sir.
Well, thank you for reading that. I remember writing that sentence. I got into a groove, as you can kind of hear from the cadence of the words. But I didn't finish the earlier story about how it took 68 weeks for anyone to get from one coast to the other coast before the transcontinental was built. And when it was completed, it could go from 6 to 8 days. So one could go very easily across the country in safety and comfort and some lower costs than previously. So that transformed the country in so many different ways. It made it unified politically, militarily, culturally. You could think about in new ways. You could get from New York to California. If you're from European immigrant, you could just land in New York Harbor, and a few days later get on a train, and then a week later you'd be in California. And so California just transformed in the late 19th century and early 20th. California is like a separate country in a sense today culturally. And you said you're from California. California is it's incredible, beautiful place of the country, but very much important economically and politically. Now, that railroad also made it possible for the United States, for the Union, the North, to consolidate its hold over the whole country, because the South didn't have any kind of comparable railroad lines. But today, talk about infrastructure. I think most Americans have no clue at all about what's going on in China just with infrastructure. You numbered a number of things that China's doing now, to its credit. But let's just take the high-speed Gaotie, the railroad lines.
It's amazing.
I was in China a few years ago. I mean, I just am so impressed with the railroad system. And you get long distances. I was in Europe this past summer. I love the European transit line too. But these long lines that can take you high speed from Beijing to Shanghai several times, I don't know how many days on the hour they go back and forth with thousands of passengers, or go from Guangzhou to Chongqing, or even go out to Tibet, there's just so much that can be done. And the United States can't build anything like that. There's been a plan to build a high-speed line from San Francisco to Los Angeles. It makes lots of sense. It's still stuck. It's been there for 10 years now, and it's not anywhere near even breaking ground in some substantial ways. And that hurts the United States. It can't bring in the technology. There are political problems, economic problems. But then there's another example that I think harms the United States is you mentioned EVs, electric vehicles. EV sales keep going up. I spoke to some Swedish researchers recently. They said that 70% of the EV market in Europe is Chinese vehicles, BYD and others. And they're tremendous cars. They're great. I haven't driven one, but everything I've read about them, they said they're incomparable. But there are virtually no Chinese EVs in the United States because of the high tariff. They're keeping them out so the American companies can try to build their own vehicles, which they're doing. But one can think about how things could be different if there were more collaboration, more openness, exchange, even competition between Chinese EV companies, robotic companies, solar panel companies, all these type of technology companies, battery companies, between the two, and make things more efficient, cheaper for everybody, and for the consumer to have access to extraordinary advanced vehicles.
I completely agree with everything you said, and I hope that the United States and China can collaborate. Maybe there's a way for U.S. companies and Chinese companies to get together and work in the United States for the benefit of the United States. But that's all the time that we have. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time, for your insights, Professor Chang.
It's been my pleasure, Jason. Thank you.